In the year 1405, when the Council of Pisa sought to heal the Great Western Schism and the Venetian Republic tightened its grip on the Adriatic trade routes, a child was born in the fortress town of Kruji, in what the Byzantines still called Epirus, and what the local chieftains knew as the Albanian highlands, a region so fractured by clan loyalty and mountain geography that no single authority had ever truly mastered it. Not the Romans in their prime, not the Bulgarian Tsars, not even the Serbian Empire of Stefan Dušan, which had crumbled after his death, leaving nothing but competing warlords and the inexorable advance of a new power from the east. The child's father was Gjergj Kastrioti, lord of territories that stretched from the Adriatic coast inland to valleys where shepherds spoke a language older than Latin, where Byzantine Christianity mixed with customs that predated Constantine, and where loyalty to kin superseded any oath to distant emperors or sultans. Gjergj had navigated the treacherous waters of Balkan politics with the skill of a man who understood that survival in this borderland required the flexibility of reed rather than the rigidity of oak, paying tribute now to Venice, now to the Serbian despots, and increasingly to the Ottoman Beylik that had transformed itself from a frontier principality into an empire spanning 2 continents. The child was named Gjergj, though the world would come to know him by another name entirely, a name that would be shouted in triumph from castle walls and whispered in fear in the pavilions of sultans. His early years unfolded in a world already disappearing, where his father's stone fortress dominated the landscape but could not dominate the future, where the old ways of tribal confederation and mountain autonomy confronted the new reality of gunpowder empires and centralized bureaucracies. The Ottoman system under Murad II was not merely a military machine but a sophisticated state apparatus that had learned to transform conquest into administration, rebellion into incorporation, and the sons of defeated enemies into the empire's most loyal servants. This last mechanism, the devshirme system, had been perfected over generations, taking Christian boys from their families, converting them to Islam, and raising them in a culture of absolute devotion to the Sultan, a loyalty uncomplicated by local ties or familial obligations because those ties had been severed in childhood. In 1423, when Gjergj was perhaps 18 years old, his father made a calculation that would alter the trajectory of not just one life, but of an entire region's history. The Ottoman forces were advancing through the Balkans with methodical inevitability, and Gjergj Kastrioti, assessing his options with the cold pragmatism of a mountain lord who had survived decades of shifting alliances, chose submission over annihilation. The terms were harsh, but not unusual for the time. Recognition of Ottoman suzerainty, payment of tribute, and the delivery of hostages to guarantee good behaviour. Among those hostages were Gjergj's sons, including young Gjergj, who was taken to Adrianople, the Ottoman capital before the final conquest of Constantinople, and placed into the very system designed to erase his former identity and forge him into an instrument of imperial will. The devshirme was not simple kidnapping, but rather a calculated program of cultural transformation that recognised something the old Christian kingdoms often did not, that loyalty could be manufactured through education, religion, and opportunity. Gjergj was converted to Islam and given the name Iskender, after Alexander the Great, that Macedonian conqueror, whose legend had never died in these lands where he had marched his phalanxes toward Persia. The Turkish rendering of Alexander was Iskender, and the addition of the honorific Bey created Skanderbeg, which would be corrupted in Latin chronicles to Skanderbeg, the name that would echo through centuries. The young Albanian was not merely renamed but remade. Trained in the palace schools where the Ottoman elite learned warfare, administration, theology, and the complex etiquette of imperial service, he studied the Quran and the Hadiths, learned Turkish and Arabic alongside his native Albanian and the Greek he had absorbed in his multilingual homeland, and most importantly, he was instructed in the Ottoman military arts, which had proven superior to the feudal levies of Christian Europe. The transformation was remarkably successful, perhaps too successful, for Iskender proved not just competent, but exceptional, displaying a talent for military command that brought him to the attention of Sultan Murad himself. He was given command of cavalry units, then larger formations, and he fought in the Sultan's wars with a skill that earned him titles and estates. He campaigned in Anatolia against rival Turkish beyliks that refused to acknowledge Ottoman supremacy, learning in those eastern wars how the Ottomans fought against enemies who used similar tactics, how they employed misdirection and rapid movement, and the feigned retreat that had been a Turkish specialty since the days of the Huns. He fought in the Balkans too, against Serbian despots and Hungarian armies, and in these campaigns he would have ridden past lands that resembled his homeland, would have seen Christian peasants who spoke languages related to Albanian, would have been reminded constantly of what he had been before the devshirme had claimed him. The question of what Iskender thought during these years, whether he felt genuine devotion to the Ottoman cause, or whether some kernel of his original identity remained dormant beneath the layers of Islamic education and military glory, is one that chronicles cannot definitively answer, because the chroniclers wrote after his great betrayal, and they shaped their narratives to fit his later actions. Some claimed he always intended to return to his people, that he was a secret Christian throughout his years of Ottoman service, but this smells of hagiography, of the need to make his story morally simple when the reality was almost certainly more complex. More plausible is that he inhabited both identities genuinely, that he was sincerely Muslim and sincerely Ottoman while also being the son of Albanian mountains, and that the contradiction only became unbearable when circumstances forced a choice. That circumstance arrived in 1443, though its roots lay in the perpetual Ottoman drive to expand into Central Europe, a drive that brought them into conflict with the Kingdom of Hungary, the last substantial Christian power standing between the Sultan and the heart of Europe. Murad had fought Hungarian armies before, most notably at Varna in 1444, but in the autumn of 1443 he was assembling forces for another Balkan campaign, and Skanderbeg was assigned a command in this army. The campaign went poorly from the start, with logistics problems and unusually effective Hungarian resistance, and somewhere in the chaos of retreat and recrimination, Iskender made his move. The exact details are obscured by contradictory sources, some claiming he had been planning defection for years, others that he acted on sudden opportunity. But the outcome was clear. He forged documents bearing the Sultan's seal, used them to gain control of the fortress of Cluj, his father's old stronghold which had passed to Ottoman administration, declared himself a Christian again with his baptismal name Gjergj restored, and raised the banner of rebellion. The audacity of this act cannot be overstated, for Iskender was not some provincial governor in a distant frontier, but a proven military commander who knew Ottoman strategy and tactics intimately, who understood the imperial system from within, and who now placed all that knowledge in service of resistance. He knew the Ottoman army's order of battle, its command structure, its supply systems, and its operational methods because he had been part of that machine for 2 decades. He knew which regional governors were competent and which were political appointments, knew the rivalry between the Janissary Corps and the Sipahi cavalry, knew the tension between the devshirme-originated administrators and the old Turkish aristocracy, and he knew the empire's vulnerabilities precisely because he had helped defend against them. His defection was not merely a military loss but an intelligence catastrophe, as if a modern general with access to classified war plans had suddenly appeared leading enemy forces. Gjergj, as we must now call him again, though history would preserve the name Skanderbeg, moved with remarkable speed to consolidate his position before Ottoman retaliation could arrive. He sent emissaries to the scattered Albanian chieftains, those mountain lords who had maintained varying degrees of autonomy under nominal Ottoman oversight, and he appealed to them not with abstract calls for Christian unity, but with concrete warnings about Ottoman intentions. The empire, he argued, would never tolerate genuine Albanian independence, but would gradually tighten its administrative control until the old noble families were reduced to Ottoman functionaries or eliminated entirely. Their lands distributed to Turkish Timeriots, their castles garrisoned by Janissaries, their sons taken in endless devshirme levies. Some of these lords remembered Gjergj Kastrioti and were willing to support his son. Others calculated that rebellion might succeed where submission guaranteed slow extinction, and still others were motivated by simple opportunism, sensing that a leader who understood Ottoman methods might actually win. In 1444, Skanderbeg achieved something no one had managed in this fractious land for centuries. He assembled a league of Albanian nobles who agreed, however temporarily, to subordinate their feuds to a common cause. The League of Leisure, named for the town where they gathered, was less a unified state than a military confederation, each lord retaining autonomy in his own territories, but pledging to contribute forces to collective defence and recognise Skanderbeg as commander-in-chief in time of war. The agreement was fragile, sustained by personal relationships and the immediate Ottoman threat rather than any constitutional framework, but it created something approaching a functional Albanian resistance at precisely the moment when Murad was distracted by other concerns, including the crusading army that would meet disaster at Varna. The news of an Ottoman defeat at Varna in November 1444 reached the Albanian highlands with mixed implications, for while it demonstrated that the Sultan's armies were not invincible, it also eliminated the Hungarian forces that might have been powerful allies and left Skanderbeg's small confederation facing the Ottoman Empire essentially alone. Venice watched from its coastal holdings with commercial interest but limited military commitment, preferring to maintain trade relationships with the Ottomans while quietly encouraging any force that might keep Turkish attention focused elsewhere. The Papal States issued encouraging letters and occasional subsidies but could provide no armies, while the Kingdom of Naples, ruling southern Italy just across the Adriatic, saw potential advantage in an Albanian buffer state, but also feared overcommitting to a cause that might collapse. Skanderbeg understood that he could not defeat the Ottoman Empire in conventional warfare, could not match its armies in size or firepower or resources, but he also understood, better than perhaps any Christian commander of his generation, that the empire's strength contained inherent limitations. Ottoman armies were formidable in set-piece battles on favourable terrain. Their combination of disciplined Janissary infantry and swift Sipihi cavalry supported by increasingly effective artillery, but they were less effective in mountain warfare where their numerical superiority was negated by geography, where supply lines stretched dangerously long, and where local knowledge provided decisive tactical advantage. The Albanian highlands were ideal defensive terrain, a maze of peaks and valleys where small forces could block mountain passes, where fortified towns could withstand sieges long enough to disrupt campaign timetables, and where an army could appear, strike, and vanish into landscapes that Ottoman commanders from Anatolian plains found utterly bewildering. The first major Ottoman expedition against Skanderbeg came in 1445, led by commanders who expected to crush what they assumed was a typical provincial rebellion by overwhelming force. They anticipated that Albanian resistance would collapse once a substantial imperial army appeared, that the mountain lords would calculate the hopelessness of their position and submit, that Skanderbeg himself might be betrayed by rivals jealous of his authority. Instead, they encountered a defence in depth that exploited every geographical advantage, harassed their supply columns, avoided decisive battle while inflicting steady casualties, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Ottoman operational planning. When the expedition withdrew without achieving its objectives, having lost men, time, and prestige, the matter transformed from a local disturbance into an imperial embarrassment. Murad responded by sending larger forces under more prestigious commanders, beginning a pattern that would repeat for decades. The Ottomans would assemble an army, march into Albania, besiege fortresses that proved unexpectedly resilient, suffer from extended supply lines through hostile territory, face raids and ambushes from forces that refused conventional battle, lose soldiers to disease and desertion as campaigns dragged on, and eventually withdraw with little to show for enormous expenditure. Skanderbeg's strategy was fundamentally defensive, focused on survival rather than conquest, on making Albanian territory so costly to subdue that the Sultan would eventually conclude that other frontiers offered better returns on military investment. This required not just military skill but diplomatic acumen, keeping the fractious Albanian nobles united, extracting enough support from Venice and Naples and the papacy to continue resistance without becoming dependent on any of them, and maintaining morale through years when victory meant simply not losing. The fortress of Kruji became the symbolic and strategic centre of this resistance, a castle perched on mountainside that controlled approaches to the interior highlands and whose walls had been strengthened by Skanderbeg's engineers using techniques he had learned in Ottoman service. The Ottomans besieged it in 1450, bringing siege guns that represented the latest military technology, the bronze cannons that had battered down walls throughout the Balkans, and would soon shatter the legendary defences of Constantinople itself. The siege lasted months, with Ottoman engineers digging mines to collapse walls while defenders countermined, with artillery bombardments that consumed expensive gunpowder to limited effect against fortifications positioned on steep slopes where angles made targeting difficult, and with assaults that broke against determined defenders who knew that surrender meant execution or enslavement. When the Ottoman army finally withdrew, defeated not by a decisive battle but by logistics and disease and the approach of winter, Skanderbeg's prestige soared throughout Christian Europe. Here was a commander who had beaten the Ottomans repeatedly, who had defended Christianity when great kingdoms had failed, and whose story offered hope in an era when Ottoman expansion seemed unstoppable. Papal propagandists lionized him as the athlete of Christ. Humanist scholars compared him to classical heroes, and European courts that did little to actually help his struggle nonetheless celebrated his victories in tournaments and pageants. This fame was double-edged, for while it brought some material support in the form of money and mercenaries, it also raised expectations that Skanderbeg would somehow reverse Ottoman conquest throughout the Balkans, expectations completely disconnected from his actual capabilities and resources. He commanded perhaps 10,000 men when his entire confederation was mobilized, ruling territories with a combined population smaller than a medium-sized Italian city-state. Yet European imagination transformed him into a potential saviour of Christendom. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 to Mehmed II, Murad's son who succeeded him, reframed the entire strategic situation. The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for a millennium as the eastern bulwark of Christianity, ceased to exist in a matter of weeks once Mehmed's cannons breached the Theodosian walls, and janissaries poured through the streets toward Hagia Sophia. The psychological impact reverberated throughout Europe, for if Constantinople could fall, what city was safe? What kingdom could consider itself secure? Venice immediately negotiated favourable terms with the new sultan, prioritising commercial access over religious solidarity, while other powers issued alarmed calls for crusades that never materialised. Skanderbeg's Albania suddenly became even more isolated, an island of resistance in an Ottoman sea, for with Constantinople fallen, Ottoman power in the Balkans was no longer contested by any major state. Mehmed, who history would call the Conqueror, was a different sort of opponent than his father, younger and more ambitious, determined not just to maintain the empire but to expand it dramatically. He saw this subjugation of Albania not as a peripheral issue, but as essential to secure Ottoman control of the Balkans before launching his planned campaigns into Hungary and beyond. A rebellious territory led by a renegade who knew Ottoman secrets was intolerable, a challenge to imperial authority that undermined the Sultan's prestige with every year it continued. Mehmed brought to the Albanian problem resources and attention that Murad, occupied with multiple fronts, had never fully committed, and he brought something else as well. Personal anger, for the continued defiance of Skanderbeg was a rebuke to the Sultan who had conquered Constantinople. The siege of Kruja in 1457 was conducted with unprecedented scale, Mehmed personally directing operations, bringing a massive artillery train that included the largest guns in the Ottoman arsenal, surrounding the fortress with an army that contemporary chroniclers numbered at 100,000 men, though the real figure was probably half that, still vastly outnumbering the defenders. The Sultan expected a relatively quick victory, for no fortress had withstood his siegecraft for long, and he made elaborate preparations to receive Skanderbeg's submission personally. Instead, the siege became a grinding stalemate, with the fortress walls proving more resilient than anticipated, defenders making sorties that disrupted Ottoman works, and disease spreading through the besieging army's crowded camps. Skanderbeg himself was not trapped inside but operated in the surrounding territory, raiding supply convoys and forcing the Ottomans to detach forces to protect their lines of communication, applying exactly the strategy of elastic defence that frustrated every attempt at decisive resolution. After months of siege, with autumn rains turning the siege camps into mud, and with his army's morale deteriorating, Mehmed faced an unwelcome reality. He could continue the siege through winter with mounting losses and no guarantee of success, or he could withdraw and suffer the humiliation of failure. He withdrew, and the humiliation was profound, for the Sultan who had conquered Constantinople had been defeated by a mountain fortress defended by a relative handful of Albanians. The propaganda impact rippled through both Christian and Muslim worlds, with European courts celebrating Skanderbeg's triumph and Ottoman rivals of the Sultan quietly noting his failure. Mehmed would attempt to reduce Albania again, sending armies in subsequent years, but he would not personally lead another Albanian campaign, suggesting that the memory of Kruja ranked among his most bitter defeats. These victories, however remarkable, came at terrible cost that chronicles often overlook in their focus on battles and sieges. The Albanian territories under Skanderbeg's control were repeatedly devastated by Ottoman raids, their villages burned, crops destroyed, populations killed or enslaved. The economic base of resistance eroded with each campaign, for while Skanderbeg could prevent Ottoman conquest, he could not prevent Ottoman destruction. Agriculture, the foundation of the medieval economy, was disrupted by armies trampling fields and peasants fleeing to mountain refuges, leaving crops unharvested and livestock scattered. Trade, never robust in these highland regions, virtually ceased as merchants avoided war zones. The population declined through casualties and enslavement and emigration, with many Albanians fleeing across the Adriatic to Italy, where colonies of refugees established communities that preserved Albanian language and customs in exile. Skanderbeg's own life during these decades of constant warfare was one of unrelenting pressure, managing not just military operations but the complex politics of the Albanian League, mediating between nobles whose cooperation was essential, but whose rivalries constantly threatened to fracture the confederation. The lord of one region would refuse to send troops because of a blood feud with the lord of another region, or would demand a larger share of booty, or would threaten to negotiate separately with the Ottomans if his interests were not respected. Skanderbeg maintained unity through a combination of diplomatic skill, personal prestige earned through victory and, when necessary, ruthless suppression of those who threatened the common cause. He executed rivals who plotted with the Ottomans, confiscated lands from those who failed in their obligations, and married into important families to create kinship networks that reinforced political alliances, taking as his wife Gjergj Kastrioti, who shared his surname but was from a different branch of the family. A marriage that consolidated holdings and produced a son, Gjon, named for Skanderbeg's father. The international dimension of his struggle required equally constant attention, for Albanian resistance depended on foreign support that was always inadequate but never quite insufficient. Venice provided money and occasionally troops, but always calibrated to their commercial interests, increasing support when they needed Ottoman attention diverted, and reducing it when they sought better trade terms. The papacy contributed funds raised through special indulgences and sent priests to minister to the Albanian Christians and report back to Rome. But papal resources were divided among many projects, and papal attention shifted with each new pontiff. Naples under Alfonso the Magnanimous, and later his son Ferrante, provided the most consistent support, including troops and military supplies, motivated by the strategic calculation that an independent Albania prevented Ottoman naval dominance of the Adriatic. Skanderbeg had to maintain relationships with all these powers simultaneously, accepting their conditions and tolerating their interference in his internal affairs, because the alternative was facing the Ottomans entirely alone. He travelled to Italy himself in 1460–61, feted as a hero in Naples and Rome, received by Pope Pius II, who was attempting to organise a crusade, paraded through streets where crowds cheered the defender of Christendom. The pageantry obscured a darker reality. He was there essentially begging for support, making commitments to participate in offensive operations against the Ottomans that he knew he lacked resources to fulfill, promising Italian lords that investments in Albanian defence would yield strategic returns, while knowing that his small confederation could barely defend itself, much less threaten Ottoman power. The Italian sojourn produced some financial support and diplomatic recognition, but not the army he needed. And when he returned to Albania, he found that in his absence, Ottoman forces had raided deep into his territories, and some Albanian nobles, doubting his return, had begun negotiating their own arrangements with Ottoman governors. The 1460s brought a new pattern to the conflict, as both sides adapted to stalemate. The Ottomans shifted from massive invasion forces attempting decisive victory to a strategy of persistent pressure through annual raids and targeted sieges, aiming to gradually wear down Albanian capacity to resist. They built new fortresses in occupied Albanian territories to consolidate control and project power, garrisoned by troops who were rotated regularly to prevent the kind of local accommodation that might weaken their loyalty. They also intensified diplomatic efforts to split the Albanian Confederation, offering generous terms to individual nobles who would submit, including recognition of their holdings and positions within the Ottoman administrative structure. Some accepted, calculating that Skanderbeg's resistance could not continue indefinitely, and that accommodation now might preserve their families and lands, while continuing resistance to the bitter end might result in complete annihilation. Skanderbeg responded by becoming, if anything, more aggressive in his defensive strategy, launching raids into Ottoman-controlled territories in Albania, and even across the borders into Macedonia and northern Greece, taking booty and slaves and demonstrating that Ottoman control of these regions was contested. These raids served multiple purposes. They provided material resources that supported continued resistance. They boosted Albanian morale by showing that the initiative was not entirely Ottoman, and they forced Ottoman commanders to disperse their forces to protect vulnerable areas, rather than concentrating them for invasions. The raids also maintained Skanderbeg's reputation for military prowess, at a time when he could no longer win the kind of dramatic victories over siege armies that had made him famous in the 1450s. The year 1466 brought renewed Ottoman invasion on a scale not seen since Mehmed's personal campaign, this time led by Balaban Pasha, a commander who had studied Skanderbeg's tactics and developed countermeasures. Balaban avoided the mistake of previous Ottoman generals who had fixated on capturing Kruja, instead conducting a war of systematic devastation, burning everything that could be burned, destroying fortifications that could not be permanently held, and attempting to draw Skanderbeg into the kind of pitched battle where Ottoman numerical superiority would be decisive. The campaign ravaged Albanian territories even more thoroughly than previous invasions, leaving regions so devastated that they could not recover between Ottoman campaigns, creating a vicious cycle of destruction that undermined the material basis for continued resistance. Skanderbeg, now in his 60s, still personally led forces in the field despite age and the accumulated exhaustion of decades of warfare. He understood that his personal presence was essential to maintain Albanian morale and unity, that his nobles and soldiers fought with greater determination when they could see him sharing their dangers, but the strain was becoming unsustainable, physically and strategically, for he was irreplaceable, and the Confederation had no succession mechanism, no institutional structure that could survive his death. The question of succession was acute because his son, John, was still young, untested in command and likely incapable of maintaining the personal authority that held the Albanian League together. Some of Skanderbeg's subordinates had proven capable commanders but lacked his prestige and his intimate knowledge of Ottoman methods, while the great noble families who might claim leadership were too divided by mutual rivalries to unite behind any single successor. In late 1467 or early 1468, the exact date being uncertain in the chronicles, Skanderbeg fell ill with fever, perhaps malaria, which was endemic in the coastal lowlands, perhaps some other disease common in an era when military camps were breeding grounds for contagion. He had survived countless battles and sieges, had escaped ambushes and assassination attempts, but he could not escape disease. He died in January 1468 in Leisure, the town where the Albanian League had been founded, and with his death the united Albanian resistance effectively ended. His son Gjon attempted to maintain the struggle, but lacked his father's abilities and authority. The Albanian nobles began negotiating separate arrangements with the Ottomans, and within little more than a decade the last pockets of organised resistance had collapsed. Kruja itself, which had withstood multiple sieges during Skanderbeg's lifetime, fell to Ottoman forces in 1478, its population dispersed and the fortress partially dismantled to prevent it from becoming a symbol of future resistance. The Ottoman conquest of Albania that followed Skanderbeg's death was methodical and comprehensive, incorporating the territories into the empire's provincial administration, registering lands and populations in the detailed tax surveys that were a hallmark of Ottoman bureaucracy, and beginning the long process of Islamization that would eventually make Albania unique in the Balkans as a majority Muslim territory. This Islamization was not primarily the result of forced conversion, but rather of incentives built into the Ottoman system, where Muslims paid lower taxes, had access to positions in administration and military, and avoided the devshirme levy that targeted Christian populations. Over generations, Albanian families converted, sometimes entirely, sometimes with some sons converting to access Ottoman careers, while others remained Christian, creating the confessionally mixed society that would characterize Albania for centuries. The memory of Skanderbeg, however, proved more difficult for the Ottomans to conquer than his actual territories. His legend spread throughout Christian Europe, embellished and mythologized, transformed from the complex historical figure who had been both Ottoman commander and Christian rebel into a simplified icon of resistance to Islam. Histories were written celebrating his victories, often with casualty figures and dramatic details that bore little relation to historical reality, and these histories were printed and reprinted, translated into multiple languages, read by audiences from England to Poland. He became a character in epic poems, a subject for paintings and sculptures, invoked whenever Christian Europe felt threatened by Ottoman expansion. The historical Skanderbeg, who had fought a limited defensive war with limited objectives in a small corner of the Balkans, disappeared beneath layers of hagiography and propaganda, replaced by a fantasy Skanderbeg who supposedly came close to destroying the Ottoman Empire single-handedly. This legendary Skanderbeg served European psychological needs more than historical accuracy, providing reassurance that Muslim powers could be defeated, that individual genius and Christian faith could overcome numerical and material disadvantages, that resistance was not futile even when circumstances appeared hopeless. The reality was more ambiguous and perhaps more interesting. Skanderbeg had delayed Ottoman conquest of Albania by a quarter century, had inflicted defeats on Ottoman armies, and damaged the prestige of sultans, but he had not fundamentally altered the trajectory of Ottoman expansion or prevented the eventual incorporation of his homeland into the empire. His resistance had imposed costs but not prohibitive costs, had complicated Ottoman planning but not derailed it, had inspired Christian Europe but not mobilized it to effective action. From an Ottoman perspective, the Skanderbeg episode represented both failure and eventual success, a frustrating delay in consolidating control of the Balkans, but ultimate achievement of strategic objectives. Ottoman chronicles written by historians serving the sultans tended to minimize Skanderbeg's importance, treating the Albanian campaigns as minor operations on the periphery of more significant conquests. Though the resources committed to those campaigns and the attention they received from multiple sultans suggest they were considered more serious than later official histories admitted. Some Ottoman writers acknowledge Skanderbeg's military skills, attributing them to his Ottoman training, and thus implicitly crediting the superiority of Ottoman military education, while criticizing the disloyalty that led him to betray the sultan who had elevated and honoured him. The question of Skanderbeg's own religious identity remained contested, for while he publicly returned to Christianity and fought under Christian banners, his 2 decades of Ottoman service and Islamic education had genuinely shaped him. Some scholars have suggested that his religious commitment was primarily political, that he adopted whichever faith served his current allegiance. But this probably underestimates the sincerity of religious belief in the 15th century, when faith and identity were inseparable. More plausible is that his internal religious landscape was complicated, that he could have been sincerely Muslim during his Ottoman years and sincerely Christian after his return, that his identity was not fixed, but evolved through the dramatic circumstances of his life. The modern concept of religious identity as singular and unchanging across a lifetime would have been foreign to medieval experience, where conversion was relatively common, and where people inhabited religious cultures more than they held abstract theological positions. His military legacy extended beyond his immediate historical context, for the strategies and tactics he employed against the Ottomans became subjects of study in European military academies. His use of terrain to compensate for numerical inferiority, his combination of defensive fortifications with mobile raiding forces, his understanding of logistics and supply as decisive factors in campaigning, and his appreciation for intelligence and deception all represented sophisticated military thinking that anticipated later developments in warfare. European commanders facing Ottoman armies in Hungary and elsewhere sought to learn from Skanderbeg's example. though often the lessons were superficial, focusing on tactical details rather than the strategic insight that allowed a small confederation to survive against an empire for decades. The Albanian national awakening in the 19th century, when Balkan peoples were constructing national identities from historical materials to support independence movements against Ottoman and other imperial controls, seized upon Skanderbeg as a founding hero, the defender of Albanian identity against foreign domination. This nationalist Skanderbeg was again a simplification of the historical figure, for the 15th century Albanian confederation he led was tribal and feudal rather than national in any modern sense, united by opposition to Ottoman conquest rather than by shared nationalism, and probably incapable of imagining the nation-state that 19th century Albanian intellectuals sought to create. The historical Skanderbeg had fought to preserve his own power and the traditional privileges of the Albanian nobility more than to defend abstract Albanian nationhood. But nationalist movements require heroes, and Skanderbeg's actual achievements were remarkable enough to support the myth-making. Modern scholarship attempting to disentangle the historical Skanderbeg from centuries of legend faces significant challenges, for the primary sources are limited and often contradictory. Ottoman chronicles were written from the perspective of the power he opposed and often minimise or distort his actions, while European chronicles were written by authors who never visited Albania and relied on second-hand information filtered through multiple languages and cultural assumptions. The Albanian sources are few because Albanian literacy was limited, and because political instability prevented the development of strong chronicle traditions. What emerges from critical analysis of these sources is a picture of a skilled commander who understood both Ottoman and European military systems, a canny politician who manipulated great powers to support his small confederation, and a leader whose personal authority held together a fragile alliance that his death immediately dissolved. His economic situation throughout the decades of resistance was precarious, for waging continuous war required resources that his small territories could barely provide. He relied on plunder from raids, on subsidies from Venice and Naples and the papacy, on taxation of his own people that often approached confiscatory levels, and on debasement of coinage that provided short-term revenue at the cost of long-term economic stability. The Albanian economy during his rule was essentially a war economy, with normal productive activities subordinated to military necessity, and this could not be sustained indefinitely. The contrast with the Ottoman Empire, which waged war in Albania while simultaneously campaigning in Anatolia and Hungary, and the Mediterranean, drawing on resources from territories spanning millions of square kilometres and tens of millions of people, illustrates the fundamental asymmetry that Skanderbeg confronted. The fortifications he defended and the castles he garrisoned were not impressive by the standards of Western European military architecture, lacking the elaborate concentric defences of crusader castles or the massive curtain walls of major Italian fortresses, but they were well adapted to their mountainous terrain and to the resources available for their construction and maintenance. Krui was more remarkable for its position than its walls, perched on mountainside where approaching armies faced steep slopes and narrow approaches that negated numerical superiority. Other fortresses in the Albanian defensive network were similarly positioned to exploit geography, creating a system where each stronghold supported others, where forces could move along interior lines between threatened points, and where even if individual fortresses fell, the system as a whole remained functional. The human cost of these decades of warfare appears in sources only indirectly, through references to regions being depopulated, to slave markets flooded with Albanian captives, to villages abandoned and fields returning to wilderness. The chroniclers who celebrated Skanderbeg's victories rarely dwelt on what those victories cost the ordinary people of Albania, the peasants whose farms were battlefields, whose sons were conscripted into constant military service, whose daughters were captured in raids, whose productive labour was extracted through taxation to fund resistance that prolonged the warfare, devastating their lives. From the perspective of these voiceless people, who appear in sources only as statistics if they appear at all, the moral calculus of resistance might look different than it did to noble chroniclers celebrating Christian heroism against the infidel. Skanderbeg's relationship with his noble subordinates was complex, for while he needed their support and could not rule without them, he also had to prevent any from becoming powerful enough to challenge his authority or capable enough to replace him. He managed this through the classic techniques of divide and rule, favouring now one family, now another, rotating commands to prevent anyone from building an independent power base in the military forces, and intervening in succession disputes to ensure that grateful or weak heirs inherited lordships rather than strong rivals. This political management was as important to his success as his military skills, for a united Albanian opposition was formidable, while a divided one would have collapsed immediately under Ottoman pressure. The religious landscape of his Albania was more diverse than later nationalist narratives acknowledged, with Catholic Albanians in the northern highlands maintaining ties to Rome and receiving support from the papacy, Orthodox Albanians in southern regions looking to the Byzantine tradition that survived Ottoman conquest in the form of the Patriarchate, and probably a significant number who practiced syncretic combinations of Christian and pre-Christian traditions that formal religious authorities would have considered heretical, but which flourished in mountain regions where ecclesiastical control was limited. Skanderbeg himself was Catholic, and his resistance was framed in terms of defending Christendom, but he relied on Orthodox nobles and soldiers who fought alongside Catholics against the Muslim Ottomans in a coalition that transcended sectarian divisions because the Ottoman threat transcended those divisions. The question of what would have happened if Skanderbeg had lived another decade, if he had survived to see his son reach maturity and experience in command, is historically unanswerable but strategically interesting. Would the Albanian Confederation have survived longer? Or was its dissolution after his death inevitable regardless of when he died? The evidence suggests that the material exhaustion of Albanian territories from decades of warfare had reached a point where continued resistance was becoming impossible, that even Skanderbeg's military genius could not overcome the fundamental resource asymmetry, and that his death merely accelerated a collapse that was already approaching. The Ottoman Empire had essentially infinite patience for the Albanian problem, could afford to send army after army year after year, absorbing losses that would have destroyed smaller states, while Albanian resources were finite and diminishing. His legacy in military history rests on his demonstration that technological and numerical inferiority could be overcome through superior strategy, that fortifications and terrain properly used could defeat even the most powerful armies, and that defensive warfare could achieve political objectives without winning offensive victories. These lessons were studied by later commanders facing similar asymmetric challenges, from rebels against imperial powers to small states resisting larger neighbours, and elements of Skanderbeg's approach appear in insurgent strategies across subsequent centuries. Whether those later commanders actually studied Skanderbeg or independently arrived at similar conclusions from similar circumstances is often unclear, but his historical example provided a reference point and a source of inspiration for the possibility of successful resistance against overwhelming odds. The transformation of his name from Gjergj Kastrioti to Iskenderbeg to Skanderbeg reflects the multilingual, multicultural world of the 15th century Balkans, where identities were fluid and where a person might be called different names in different contexts by different people. The fixation of his name as Skanderbeg in Western sources, while Albanian sources preserved Gjergj and Ottoman sources remembered, Iskender illustrates how historical memory is constructed differently in different cultural traditions, each emphasizing aspects of his identity that fit their narratives while minimizing aspects that complicate those narratives. The historical figure existed at the intersection of these traditions, comprehensible only when all versions are considered together rather than privileging one as authentic and dismissing others as distortion. In the centuries after his death, as the Ottoman Empire reached its maximum extent and then began its long decline, Skanderbeg's resistance was reinterpreted through each era's concerns. In the 16th century, as the Ottomans threatened Vienna and seemed poised to conquer Central Europe, he was invoked as a prophet of successful resistance, proof that the Turk could be beaten. In the 17th century, as the Ottoman threat receded and European powers went on the offensive, he became a crusading hero who had kept alive the spirit of Christian reconquest during dark times. In the 18th century, as the Enlightenment questioned traditional religious narratives, some writers reimagined him as a secular hero fighting for liberty rather than Christianity. In the 19th century, he was nationalised, claimed by Albanian nationalism as the founder of the nation, and this nationalist Skanderbeg was the version that would dominate in the 20th century and persist into the present. Each of these reimaginings contained elements of truth, but none captured the full complexity of the historical figure, who was simultaneously Christian crusader and Ottoman renegade. defender of feudal privilege and obstacle to imperial expansion, military genius and desperate rebel, devout believer and political pragmatist. The contradictions in his life were products of the contradictions of his time, when the medieval order was collapsing but the modern order had not yet emerged, when religious identity was central but also negotiable, when loyalty was personal but could be transferred, when warfare was becoming more technological and bureaucratic, but still depended on individual charisma and leadership. Skanderbeg's life spanned the transition between these worlds, and his success came partly from his ability to operate in both simultaneously. The Ottoman Empire that he fought against would persist for another 4.5 centuries after his death, conquering vast additional territories, besieging Vienna, dominating the Mediterranean, and becoming one of the great powers of early modern Europe before entering its long decline, and finally collapsing after the First World War. The Albanian territories he defended would remain under Ottoman control for most of those centuries, their populations largely converting to Islam, their administrative structures absorbed into the Ottoman provincial system, their distinct identity preserved primarily through language rather than religion or political independence. When Albania finally achieved independence in the early 20th century, it was not through military resistance in the Skanderbeg tradition, but through the intersection of great power politics as the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, and European powers sought to prevent any one of them from controlling the strategic territory. Yet Skanderbeg's resistance had mattered, not because it prevented Ottoman conquest, but because it delayed that conquest long enough to preserve a memory of Albanian independence that could be revived centuries later, because it demonstrated that Albanian forces could defeat Ottoman armies, and thus established a tradition of martial competence, and because it created a hero whose legend could inspire subsequent generations. The material achievements of his quarter-century resistance were largely erased within decades of his death, but the symbolic achievements persisted, carried forward in chronicles and legends, and eventually in the national consciousness of a people who found in his story a usable past for constructing modern identity.